Hi, today I am reading you an email that I received lately. The email is about the story of US Marines who kicked the old veteran out of the first class seat. The email says, "You are in my seat, old timer, and I don't think you can afford the upgrade." The voice was crisp, arrogant, and loud enough to silence the entire first class cabin. Standing in the aisle was Second Lieutenant Miller, a young Marine officer wearing his service alphas like a costume, his gold bars gleaming under the cabin lights. He was looming over seat 1A, where an elderly man named Silas sat slumped against the window. Silas looked like a wreck, wearing a cracked brown leather flight jacket that smelled of old tobacco and engine oil, clutching a battered canvas helmet bag to his chest. He didn't look up. He just stared out the window at the tarmac, his hands shaking slightly. "I said move," Miller barked, tapping Silas on the shoulder with a disrespect that made the nearby passengers gasp. "This is for military personnel and VIPs. You look like you got lost on the way to the soup kitchen. The stewardess is coming to escort you back to coach where you belong." Miller thought he was clearing out a vagrant. He thought he was asserting his authority. But folks, Miller didn't see the patch on that leather jacket. He didn't know that the man he was poking was a legend who had hunted MiGs over the skies of Hanoi, while Miller's father was still in diapers. You need to see how this ends. Stick around. The atmosphere inside the narrow metal tube of Flight 492, bound for Washington, D.C., bound for Washington, D.C., bound for Losand, 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 was thick enough to chew on, a suffocating cocktail of recycled air, the sickeningly sweet smell of jet fuel wafting from the tarmac, and the palpable, vibrating tension of 300 people trying to cram their lives into overhead bins that were never meant to hold that much weight, creating a friction that always seems to bring out the absolute worst in human nature. It was 0800 hours on a Monday, the witching hour for business travelers, politicians, and military personnel moving between bases, a time when patience is non-existent and the social hierarchy of the airplane cabin becomes a brutal, unspoken war zone. The first-class cabin was the castle keep, a sanctuary of wide leather seats and pre-flight cocktails, separated from the peasants and economy by a thin blue curtain that might as well have been an iron gate. Into this arena stepped Staff Sergeant Miller, a Marine who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that specialized in ego and starch. He was traveling with a detail of 4 other Marines, all in their service alphas, looking sharp, squared away, and completely aware of the attention they were commanding from the civilians. Miller was the leader of the pack, a man who walked with the swagger of someone who believed the stripe on his sleeve gave him jurisdiction over the entire civilian world. He was loud, taking up space, swinging his sea bag with a disregard for anyone else's personal safety, radiating that specific brand of high-speed arrogance that usually masked a deep insecurity. To Miller, this flight wasn't just transportation, it was a stage, and he was the lead actor. He had used his military ID to snag an upgrade for himself, leaving his junior Marines in Economy Plus, a move that screamed leadership failure to anyone who knew what actual leadership looked like. But Miller didn't care about optics, he cared about legroom and the free gin and tonic he was planning to order before wheels up. The cabin was already buzzing with the low-level anxiety of boarding businessmen tapping furiously on phones, a mother struggling with a crying infant, the flight attendants wearing those plastic smiles that didn't reach their eyes. But everything seemed to grind to a halt when Miller reached row 1. There, sitting in the prime spot, seat 1A, was Arthur. Arthur was an anomaly. in this gleaming, sterile environment. He looked like he had just walked out of a dust storm in 1953. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times. It was almost transparent, trousers that were held up by suspenders that had lost their elasticity, and boots that were cracked and worn down to the heel. He smelled faintly of Old Spice and mothballs, a scent that triggered memories of grandfather clocks and dusty attics. He sat clutched in the corner of the wide first-class seat, looking small, frail, and terrified, holding a plastic Piggly Wiggly bag on his lap with a grip that turned his arthritic knuckles white. He was staring out the window at the ground crew, lost in a memory, completely checking out of the chaotic reality of the boarding process. To the other passengers, the suits, the politicians, the influencers, Arthur was an eyesore, a mistake, a piece of gear adrift that had somehow floated into the VIP section. They glanced at him with that polite, devastating judgment, wondering how this homeless person had gotten past the gate agents. But nobody said anything. That is, until Miller arrived. Miller stopped in the aisle, his shadow falling over Arthur like a dark cloud. He looked at his ticket, seat 1A. Then he looked at the old man. The math didn't add up in Miller's head. In Miller's world, first class was for winners. It was for people who mattered. It certainly wasn't for geriatric men clutching grocery bags. The disconnect short-circuited Miller's professionalism and went straight to his ego. "Excuse me," Miller said, not with politeness but with the tone of a traffic cop catching a speeder. "You're in my seat." Arthur didn't hear him at first. His hearing aids were whistling slightly, and his mind was 5,000 miles away and 50 years in the past. Miller's patience, already thin, snapped. He dropped his heavy sea bag on the floor with a loud thud that shook the floorboards. "Hey, Earth to Grandpa!" Miller barked, snapping his fingers in Arthur's face. The old man jumped, startled, clutching his plastic bag tighter to his chest. He looked up, his eyes milky blue and watery, filled with a confusion that was heartbreaking to everyone except the staff sergeant. I'm sorry," Arthur rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves blowing over concrete. "My seat." Miller pointed to the headrest. "You're sitting in it. Let me see your boarding pass." Now, listen closely, because this is where the power dynamic shifts from a misunderstanding to a mugging. A real leader, a Marine worth his salt, would have assessed the situation. He would have seen the age, the frailty, the veteran hat. He would have crouched down, spoken softly, and helped the old man figure it out. But Miller wasn't a leader. He was a bully with a chevron. He saw weakness, and he decided to crush it. The lady at the gate." Arthur fumbled in his shirt pocket, his shaking hands, producing a crumpled thermal paper boarding pass. She said they had an empty seat. She said I could sit here." Miller snatched the ticket from Arthur's hand, reading it with a sneer. It did say seat 1A, but it was handwritten. An override, a courtesy upgrade given by a gate agent who probably saw a tired old veteran and wanted to do something nice. Miller didn't see kindness, he saw a violation of protocol. "This is a scribbled mess," Miller announced to the cabin, playing to the audience. "This isn't a valid ticket." Arthur was on his hands and knees in the aisle of the first-class cabin, a position no man of his age and history should ever be forced into, scrabbling at the plush blue carpet to gather the spilled contents of his torn Piggly Wiggly bag, while Staff Sergeant Miller loomed over him like a gargoyle of judgment. To the casual observer, it looked like a pathetic old man dropping his laundry, but to anyone with a shred of military bearing, it was a crime scene. The dress blue blouse that had tumbled out wasn't just clothing, it was a relic. It was made of the heavy, scratchy wool from the 1950s, not the lightweight synthetic blend these new Marines wear. The chevrons on the sleeve were sewn on by hand, Arthur's mother's hands, and they were the wide gold stripes of a gunnery sergeant, a rank that takes a lifetime of blood and sweat to earn. But Miller didn't see the rank. He didn't see the history. He saw a pile of G-dunk junk blocking his path to a gin and tonic. Look at this mess, Miller sneered, actually nudging the uniform jacket with the toe of his boot, a boot that was polished, sure, but had never walked a mile in a combat zone. You're cluttering up the deck, Grandpa. This is a safety hazard. I ought to have the air marshal zip tie you for creating a disturbance. He kicked at the jacket again, harder this time, and his boot heel caught the edge of the metal that had fallen face down. There was a sickening crunch, metal grinding against metal as the metal was scraped across the floor track of the seat. Arthur gasped, a sound of pure physical pain, as if Miller had stepped on his actual heart. He lunged forward, his old joints screaming, and covered the metal with his trembling hand. "Don't," Arthur cried out, his voice cracking. "Don't you step on it. That's for the boys." Miller rolled his eyes, looking around at the other passengers who were watching with a mix of horror and morbid curiosity. "The boys? What boys?" "The Boy Scouts. Is that a merit badge, Pop? Did you get that for helping old ladies across the street?" Miller laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that sucked the air out of the cabin. "You're a disgrace. You're probably one of those guys who buys medals at the surplus store and marches in parades to get free drinks. Stolen valor is a felony, you know. I could arrest you right now. I have jurisdiction." The flight attendant stepped in again, her hand trembling as she touched Miller's arm. "Sir, please, sit down. Let him gather his things. He's obviously distressed." Miller spun on her, his face flushing with the toxic arrogance of a man who has been given a little bit of power and thinks he's a god. "Do not touch me, ma'am. I am conducting a security assessment. This individual is unstable. Look at him. He's crying over a costume prop." "Now, unless you want me to file a report with the FAA about you interfering with a federal officer, you will go get me a drink and let me handle the trash." This is where most men would crack. They'd shout, they'd swing, or they'd fold. But this veteran, he's built different. He's cut from the cloth of the frozen chosen. Watch this. Arthur didn't look up at Miller. He focused entirely on the medal in his hand. He turned it over. It was the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. The ribbon was frayed. The bronze was tarnished with age. But it was heavy. It held the weight of a frozen ridge in North Korea. It held the weight of the men who didn't come back. Arthur wiped the dust off it with his thumb, his hands shaking violently. He carefully, reverently folded the wool jacket, brushing off the lint from the airplane carpet, treating the garment with more respect than Miller treated human beings. He tried to stand up, but his bad knee, the one with the shrapnel still embedded in the bone, locked up. He stumbled, falling back against the bulkhead. Miller didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer help. He just stood there, arms crossed, tapping his foot. "Tick-tock, old-timer. We're burning daylight. If you can't walk, maybe you should have checked yourself into a home instead of a flight." The cruelty was so unnecessary, so visceral, that a young woman in row 2 started crying. A businessman stood up. "Hey, that's enough." But Miller barked, "Sit down, civilian. This is military business." The businessman sat back down, cowed by the aggression. Miller turned back to Arthur. "You are faux man. Totally beyond repair. Now grab your trash bag and get to the back of the bus. I don't want to see your face until we land." Arthur managed to get to his feet, clutching the torn bag to his chest. He looked at Miller, and for a second the milky haze in his eyes cleared. He stood up straight, or as straight as his curved spine would allow. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a disappointed father. "You wear the eagle, globe, and anchor," Arthur whispered, his voice low and steady. "But you don't know what it costs. You think it's a ticket to the front of the line. Son, it's a ticket to the front of the fight." Miller scoffed. "Save the speech for the VFW, Grandpa. Move." He shoved Arthur. A physical shove, not hard enough to knock him over, but hard enough to send him stumbling down the aisle toward economy, past the pitying eyes of the first-class passengers. Arthur walked the walk of shame, clutching his uniform, his heart breaking, not for himself, but for the corps he loved, seeing what it had become in the hands of a bully like Miller. If this disrespect makes your blood boil, you're in the right place. Because the storm isn't coming, the storm is already here. He made it to the curtain dividing the classes. He paused, looking back one last time at seat 1A, the seat he was promised, the seat where he was supposed to rest his weary bones. Miller was already settling into it, stretching his legs out, laughing with his buddies, acting like he had just conquered a hill. Arthur turned away, stepping through the curtain into the cramped, noisy world of economy, leaving his dignity on the other side. But he didn't leave his history, and he certainly didn't leave the attention of the man in the cockpit who was currently gripping the throttle with white knuckles. Arthur collapsed into the narrow middle seat in row 34, sandwiched between a teenager playing loud video games and a man sleeping with his mouth open. But Arthur didn't feel the squeeze of the armrests or the claustrophobia of the cabin. The sensory input of the plane faded away, replaced by a cold, biting wind that had been blowing through his soul for 70 years. He clutched the torn plastic bag to his chest, closing his eyes, and instantly the smell of jet fuel was replaced by the smell of frozen diesel and rotting flesh. He wasn't on a Boeing 737. He was back at the chosen reservoir, November 1950. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. The wind cut through your parka like a razor blade. Your weapon froze. Your food froze. Your tears froze before they could hit your cheek. Inside Arthur's mind, the timeline collapsed. He was having a conversation with ghosts, specifically one ghost, Gunnery Sergeant Silas Vance, the man whose uniform Arthur was currently holding in the plastic bag. You see, the uniform wasn't Arthur's. It belonged to the man who saved his life. Arthur wasn't a gunnery sergeant. He was a private first class back then, a scared kid from Iowa who thought he was going to die in the snow. Silas had found him shivering in a foxhole, frostbite turning his toes black, ready to give up. Silas had taken off his own dry socks and given them to Arthur. Silas had slapped him awake when the hypothermia set in. Silas had literally carried him down the Funchaline Pass when the Chinese army swarmed over the hills like locusts. There's a reason he isn't fighting back against this young bully. It's not because he's weak, it's because he's carrying a burden so heavy it would crush a lesser man. The trip to D.C. wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. Silas had died 2 weeks ago in a nursing home in Ohio, alone with no family left. He had been buried in a pauper's grave, because nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew he was a Navy Cross recipient. Nobody knew he was a hero. Arthur had found out too late. He had spent his entire life savings, every dime of his pension, to get Silas exhumed and approved for burial at Arlington National Cemetery, where he belonged. The uniform in the bag was the only thing Arthur had left of him. He was bringing it to lay on the coffin. He was bringing the medal to pin on the flag. That's why he was so protective of the bag. That's why the shove from Miller didn't just hurt his body, it desecrated the mission. In Arthur's mind, he was failing Silas all over again. "I'm sorry, Gunny," Arthur whispered internally, the words echoing in the vast frozen landscape of his memory. "I couldn't hold the ground. I let a boot push me around. I let him kick your medal." The shame was a cold stone in his gut. He felt small. He felt worthless. He looked down at his shaking hands that had once held a Browning automatic rifle, hands that had dug graves in the frozen earth, and he hated them for being old. He hated that he couldn't stand up to Miller. He hated that the world had moved on and forgotten men like Silas. The young staff sergeant in first class represented everything Arthur feared, a corps that had lost its soul, a generation that polished the boots but forgot the feet inside them. But then a flicker of that old frozen Charson grit sparked in the darkness of his mind. He remembered Silas's voice, rough as gravel, cutting through the wind, Get up, Marine. We don't die here. We walk out, one step at a time. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath. He tightened his grip on the plastic bag. He wasn't just an old man in economy. He was the guardian of a legacy. He was the colour guard for a funeral of one. He checked the Navy Cross through the plastic. It was scratched from Miller's boot, but it was still whole. I will get you there, Gunny, Arthur promised. I will get you to Arlington, even if I have to crawl, even if I have to walk through hell one more time. Moments like this deserve to be remembered because they show us the difference between a man who fights for himself and a man who fights for a brother. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure, but Arthur barely heard it. He was busy steeling himself. He was busy locking away the pain, just like he did in 1950. He decided he wouldn't look at Miller again. He wouldn't give that boy the satisfaction of seeing his tears. He would sit in the back, in the dark, and he would hold the line, because that's what the old breed does. They endure. They suffer in silence, so others can be comfortable. But Arthur didn't know that the silence was about to be broken. He didn't know that the pilot, a man who respected the old ways, was already plotting a course correction that had nothing to do with the flight plan. The internal world of the veteran is a fortress, usually locked tight, but Miller had breached the walls, and now reinforcements were coming from the front of the plane. The humming of the jet engines dissolved, replaced instantly by the howling, shrieking wind of the Toktong Pass, a sound that wasn't just noise but a physical assault that flayed the skin from your face and turned your marrow into ice. Arthur wasn't sitting in row 34 anymore. The cramped economy seat vanished, and he was lying prone in a shallow, frozen depression in the earth that was too hard to dig a foxhole in, his body shaking so violently that his teeth clicked together like dice in a cup. It wasn't the dark of the airplane cabin, it was the pitch-black darkness of a Korean winter night, illuminated only by the terrifying, rhythmic flashes of mortar explosions and the green traces that slashed through the snow like angry neon hornets. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero, a cold so profound, so alien, that it stopped being a weather condition and became a living, breathing monster trying to kill you before the enemy even got a shot off. Arthur felt the sensation of his toes dying inside his boots, the numbness creeping up his legs like a slow-moving poison. He was a private first class then, a kid from the cornfields who had never seen an ocean, let alone a frozen hellscape at the top of the world. His M1 Garand was frozen shut, the lubricant having turned to glue in the extreme cold, rendering the weapon useless, a glorified club in a gunfight against a human wave. And the wave was coming. You could hear them before you saw them. The bugles, that haunting, discordant sound, echoing off the canyon walls, followed by the shrill whistles and the sound of thousands of quilted boots crunching on the snow. It was the sound of the end of the world. "They're coming!" someone screamed down the line, a voice thick with panic. "Fix bayonets! They're rushing the wire!" Arthur tried to move his fingers to draw his knife, but they were stiff, useless claws inside his mittens. He was going to die here. He knew it with a calm, terrifying certainty. He was going to freeze, or he was going to be overrun, and his body would be left as a frozen marker on a map nobody cared about. The fear was a cold stone in his gut, heavier than the rucksack on his back. He left a piece of his soul back there in that snow. And folks, you need to understand that the man sitting in economy isn't just remembering a tragedy. He is reliving a debt that he can never repay. Suddenly a shadow loomed over him, blocking out the traces. It wasn't an enemy, it was a mountain of a man in a parka that looked too small for his shoulders, holding a Browning automatic rifle like it was a toy. It was Gunny Silas Vance. Even in the dark you could feel his presence, a radiator of heat and violence and a world of ice. "Get up, Marine," Silas roared, his voice cracking like a whip over the wind. We don't die in the dirt. Get that weapon working. Piss on the action, if you have to, but get it firing. Silas didn't wait. He stepped over Arthur, planting his boots firmly in the frozen snow, effectively making himself a human shield between Arthur and the oncoming horde. The Chinese forces broke through the perimeter, a sea of white uniforms blending with the snow, screaming, firing burp guns. It was chaos. It was foobar. But Silas stood there like a statue of iron. He opened up with the BR, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the heavy .3006 rounds, cutting a swath of destruction through the enemy line. He was screaming defiance, a string of profanity that would peel the paint off a battleship, drawing all the fire to himself. Arthur watched mesmerized and terrified as the gunny took a hit, a spray of red mist erupting from his shoulder, but Silas didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He just shifted his stance and kept firing. "Move, kid. Move back to the ridge," Silas yelled, not looking back. "I've got the rear. Go." But Arthur couldn't move. His legs were dead. The hypothermia had won. He tried to crawl, but he just collapsed into the snow, the blackness closing in on the edges of his vision. He was ready to let go. It was so warm in the dark. It would be so easy to just sleep. Then he felt it, a hand gripping his parka collar with the strength of a hydraulic press. Silas had turned around. The gunny, bleeding from 2 wounds now, dropped his empty weapon and grabbed Arthur. He hauled him up, throwing Arthur's arm over his good shoulder, effectively carrying the dead weight of the younger man, while rounds snapped past their heads like angry bees. "I said we walk out," Silas grunted, his breath coming in ragged, steamy clouds. "I ain't leaving you for the crows, you little bastard. You owe me a beer in Tokyo." They stumbled back through the snow, slipping on the ice, Silas taking the brunt of the elements, shielding Arthur's face from the wind with his own body. Every step was a battle. Every breath was agony. But Silas didn't stop. He dragged Arthur for 3 miles down that mountain, leaving a trail of blood in the snow that froze instantly. When they finally reached the triage tent at Hagaruri, Silas collapsed. The medics cut his parka off, and Arthur saw the damage. Bullet wounds, shrapnel, and frostbite that had turned his hands black. But Silas was smiling, that crooked, tobacco-stained smile. He looked at Arthur, shivering under a blanket, and winked. "Told you," Silas wheezed. "Marines don't leave Marines." That was the moment. That was the forge. The Navy Cross Arthur was carrying in the plastic bag wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the payment for that night. It was the recognition of the fact that Silas Vance had looked death in the eye and spat in its face to save a scared kid from Iowa. Silas never bragged about it. He never wore the medal. He kept it in a drawer for 50 years, saying he just did his job. But Arthur knew. Arthur remembered every second of that walk. And seeing that medal, the symbol of Silas's blood and Arthur's life kicked across the floor of an aeroplane by an arrogant staff sergeant who had never missed a meal, it was a desecration. It was a blasphemy worse than spitting on a crucifix. Keep listening, because that piece of his soul is about to come back to the surface. The uniform in the bag isn't laundry. It's the shroud of a savior. The sensory memory was so intense that Arthur, sitting in row 34, actually shivered, his body reacting to the phantom cold of 1950. He pulled the torn plastic bag tighter, feeling the wool of the dress blues. He could still smell the frozen diesel. He could still hear the bugles. He looked at the back of the seat in front of him, but he saw Silas's back, marching through the snow. "I won't let you down, Gunny," Arthur whispered, his voice lost in the drone of the aircraft. "I'm getting you to Arlington. I don't care about the seat. I don't care about the legroom. I just care about the promise." The flashback faded, leaving Arthur exhausted, drained, and filled with a cold, hard resolve. He wasn't afraid of Miller anymore. Miller was a gnat. Miller was a child, playing dress-up. Arthur had walked with giants, and giants don't bow to ants. The plane banked, beginning its descent toward Washington, D.C., and Arthur felt a strange calm settle over him. He knew, with the instinct of a survivor, that the mission wasn't over. He knew that the confrontation with Miller wasn't finished, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The ghost of Gunny Vance was sitting right there in the empty middle seat, riding shotgun, just like he always did, and up in the cockpit the pilot was reaching for the microphone, his eyes hard, his mind made up. The reckoning was coming, and it was going to arrive at 500 miles per hour. The wheels of Flight 492 slammed onto the tarmac of Reagan National Airport with a heavy jolt, followed by the roar of reverse thrusters, but the turbulence outside the plane was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside the cockpit. In Seat 1A, Staff Sergeant Miller was feeling good. He had spent the flight reclining in the wide leather seat, downing 2 gin and tonics, and loudly regaling the uncomfortable businessman next to him with stories of his heroics in training exercises. Miller felt vindicated. He had secured his comfort, he had enforced standards, and he had put a sloppy civilian in his place. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Miller turned to his squad of junior Marines in row 4. "See that, gents?" Miller smirked, adjusting his tie. "Command presence. You take control of the environment, or the environment takes control of you. We'll be off this bird in 5 minutes and hitting the bar." But Miller's timeline was about to get blown to pieces. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged off, but the usual rush of passengers standing up to grab their bags didn't happen. Instead, the intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the flight attendant with the usual "Welcome to DC" script. It was the pilot, and his voice sounded like grinding gears. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Stevens from the flight deck." The voice boomed, tight and controlled. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a security situation regarding a passenger that needs to be rectified immediately before anyone deplanes. The jet bridge will remain closed until I resolve this matter personally." A murmur of confusion rippled through the cabin. People glanced around nervously. Was it a terrorist? A medical emergency? The bully thinks he's won. He thinks the pilot is talking about the crazy old man in the back. He has no idea the hammer is hanging right over his own head. Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered to the businessman. "That old guy must have acted up again. Probably started yelling about his medals to the people in the back. Don't worry, I'll handle it if the captain needs backup." Miller actually unbuckled his seatbelt, preparing to stand up and offer his assistance, convinced he was the hero of this narrative. The cockpit door hissed open. Captain Striker Stevens stepped out. Stevens wasn't your average airline pilot. He was in his late 40s, silver hair cut high and tight, with the kind of eyes that had stared down surface-to-air missiles over Baghdad. He wore his uniform like armor, the 4 stripes on his shoulder boards gleaming. He didn't look at the passengers. He didn't smile. He walked into the first-class cabin with a predatory grace, his gaze locking instantly onto Seat 1A. Miller saw the pilot approaching and flashed a confident, conspiratorial grin. "Afternoon, Captain," Miller said, assuming a posture of peer-to-peer respect. "Sorry about the disturbance earlier. I handled that transient for you. Did he cause more trouble in the rear? I can escort him off if you want." Stevens stopped directly in front of Miller. He looked at the staff sergeant's ribbons. He looked at the gin and tonic glass on the tray. He looked at the relaxed, arrogant posture. Then he looked Miller in the eye. "You handled it?" Stevens asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's what you call it. Handling it." Miller's smile faltered slightly. The tone wasn't right. This wasn't gratitude. It was an interrogation. Yes, sir. He was obstructing the aisle. He had invalid credentials. I moved him to a secure location to maintain order. Standard procedure," Stevens repeated, the words dripping with ice. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, does standard procedure involved kicking a Navy cross across the deck of my aircraft. The color drained from Miller's face. The cabin went deathly silent. The businessman next to Miller shrank into his seat, trying to become invisible. "Sir," Miller stammered, "it was a piece of junk. He dropped some metal. I didn't know you didn't verify." Stevens cut him off, his voice rising, projecting to the back of the first-class cabin. "You saw a frayed coat, and you assumed. You saw an old man, and you assumed. You violated the first rule of engagement. Identify your target." Stevens took a step closer, invading Miller's personal space. "I flew close air support for Marines in Fallujah. I watched good men die in the dirt, so you could sit in that leather chair and drink gin. And I listened to the audio from the cabin. I heard you mock him. I heard you laugh. This is the turning point. Don't look away now. The sharks are circling, and Miller just realized he's bleeding." Miller shifted in his seat, the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. "Captain, with all due respect, he was looking for a free ride. He had a handwritten ticket. Stevens growled, "Because I wrote it. I paid for that seat out of my own pocket when I saw his name on the manifest. I wanted him up here because I know who he is carrying in that bag." Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pucker factor was now at maximum. He had kicked out the pilot's personal guest. He had insulted a man the pilot revered. Stevens stood up straight, addressing the entire first-class cabin. "Folks, I apologize for the delay, but we have a VIP on board who was wrongly displaced, and until he is seated in his rightful place, nobody moves. Nobody gets off this plane." Stevens looked down at Miller with pure disgust. "Get up!" Miller blinked. "Sir!" I said, "Get up!" Stevens barked. "Grab your gear. You are vacating this seat. You are going to stand in the galley. And you are going to wait." Miller scrambled up, grabbing his bag, humiliated, his face burning red, as the other passengers stared at him with judgment. He moved to the small galley area, standing awkwardly by the coffee pots. Stevens didn't watch him go. He turned his back on Miller and began to walk down the aisle, past the curtain, heading toward economy. The captain of the aircraft was leaving the flight deck to go to row 34. The passengers craned their necks to watch. Miller stood in the corner, his heart hammering, realizing that the old bum wasn't a bum at all. He was something far more dangerous. He was a legend, and Miller was about to get a front row seat to his own destruction. Captain Striker Stevens moved down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 with a deliberate predatory grace, his 4 gold stripes catching the cabin lights, his presence parting the sea of confused passengers like the bow of an icebreaker. He moved past the curtain, past the business class wannabes, and into the dense, humid air of economy. The passengers fell silent as he passed, sensing the radioactive intensity radiating from the man who held their lives in his hands. Stevens wasn't looking left or right. His eyes were locked on row 34, seat B. There, sandwiched between a teenager with oversized headphones and a snoring man who was spilling into his space, was Arthur. The old veteran had curled in on himself, clutching the torn plastic Piggly Wiggly bag to his chest like a life preserver in a storm. His head bowed, his Korean War hat pulled low to hide the shame burning on his face. He looked small. He looked defeated. He looked exactly like what Miller had called him, trash. But Stevens saw something else. He saw a monument. Stevens stopped at row 34. The teenager looked up, startled by the uniform, and pulled off his headphones. Stevens ignored him. He crouched down in the aisle, disregarding the filth on the carpet, bringing his face level with Arthur's. "Corporal Thorne?" Stevens asked, his voice soft but carrying the undeniable weight of command. Arthur flinched, his body tightening as if expecting another blow, another insult. He slowly lifted his head, his milky blue eyes widening when he saw the pilot kneeling next to him. I didn't do anything, sir," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm just sitting here. I'm not causing trouble. Please, just let me get to DC. The desperation in the old man's voice hit Stevens like a punch to the gut. It was the sound of a man who had been apologized to by no one and stepped on by everyone. I told you justice was coming. Watch the look on the faces of the people who judged him as the script gets flipped. Stevens shook his head gently. You're not in trouble, Corporal. We have a navigational error. You are currently located in the wrong sector. Stevens reached out and gently touched the torn plastic bag, his fingers brushing against the wool of the dress blue uniform inside. And Gunny Vance, he doesn't ride in the back. Not on my aircraft. Arthur froze. The name hung in the air. Gunny Vance. How did this pilot know? Arthur looked at Stevens, searching his face. You know the Gunny? I know of him, Stevens said, his eyes shining with a mixture of grief and respect. My father was in the 1st Marine Division. He was at the reservoir. He told me about the walk. He told me about the man who carried the BAR when the world froze over. Stevens paused, his voice thickening, and he told me about the kid from Iowa who wouldn't let him die. That was you, wasn't it, Artie? Tears spilled over Arthur's eyelids, tracking through the wrinkles of his weathered face. He hadn't heard his nickname in 50 years. He hadn't been recognized in longer. I just wanted to bring him home, sir. I just wanted to get him to Arlington. And you will, Stevens said, standing up and offering his hand. But you're going to do it with the dignity you earned. Grab your gear. Marine, we're moving out. Arthur stared at the hand. It was steady. It was inviting. For the first time all day, Arthur didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a brother. He reached out, his arthritic fingers grasping the captain's hand, and Stevens pulled him up with a strength that belied his age. Make a hole, Stevens announced to the passengers in the aisle seats. VIP coming through. The passengers in economy, who had watched the earlier humiliation with passive silence, now watched with awe as the pilot escorted the homeless old man up the aisle. Arthur walked differently now. He stood a little taller. He clutched the bag, not with fear but with pride. If you live for moments where arrogance meets reality, this is why you're here. The hammer hasn't just dropped, it has shattered the floor. They passed through the curtain back into first class. The atmosphere was electric. Staff Sergeant Miller was standing in the galley by the cockpit door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of sullen defiance, waiting for the captain to return so he could plead his case. Miller expected Stevens to come back alone, maybe having scolded the old man. When Miller saw Stevens walking side by side with Arthur, guiding him gently by the elbow, Miller's jaw dropped. Stevens stopped right in front of Miller. He didn't ask Miller to move. He simply stared at him until Miller stepped aside, shrinking against the beverage cart. Stevens guided Arthur to seat 1A, Miller's seat. Here we are, sir, Stevens said, helping Arthur settle into the wide leather chair. Plenty of room for the gunny. Arthur sat down, overwhelmed, sinking into the luxury he had been denied. He placed the plastic bag on his lap, smoothing out the wrinkles. Stevens turned around. He faced the cabin. Then he faced Miller. Staff Sergeant Miller. Stevens barked, his voice filling the space. Front and center, Miller shuffled forward, looking like a truant schoolboy. Sir, I really think this is unnecessary. Silence, Stevens roared. You wanted to inspect the cargo? You wanted to see what trash this man was carrying? Stevens reached down and gently pulled the Navy Cross from the plastic bag, holding it up by the ribbon. The metal caught the sunlight streaming through the window. The bronze was dull, and there was a fresh scratch on the surface from Miller's boot. Look at it, Stevens commanded. Look at what you stepped on. Miller stared at the medal, the Navy Cross. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He felt sick. He had kicked the second highest award for valor in the United States military. I didn't know, Miller whispered, his voice barely audible. Ignorance is not a defense, Staff Sergeant Stevens hissed. You judged a book by its cover, And you burned the library. Stevens turned to Arthur. Corporal Thorne, the pilot said, his voice shifting to a tone of absolute reverence. I am the captain of this vessel. I am a former naval aviator, but I am outranked on this deck. Stevens stepped back. He snapped his heels together. The sound was sharp, precise, and there, in the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, the captain rendered a slow, perfect, trembling hand salute to the old man in the flannel shirt. The cabin went dead silent. The businessman who had laughed earlier took off his glasses. The flight attendant wiped her eyes. Miller stood frozen, his face burning with a shame, so hot it felt like sunburn. Arthur looked up, stunned. He saw the respect. He saw the honor. He shifted the bag to one hand. He struggled to sit up straight in the seat, and then, with a shaking hand, Arthur Thorne returned the salute. It wasn't perfect. His arm was crooked from old injuries. His fingers were gnarled. But it was the most beautiful thing Miller had ever seen. Permission to carry on, sir? Stevens asked, holding the salute. Permission granted, Captain, Arthur whispered. Stevens cut the salute. He turned to Miller, his eyes hard as flint. Staff Sergeant, Stevens said coldly, you are dismissed to your new post. Miller looked around, confused. My post? Sir, the flight is full. There are no seats. I know, Stevens said, pointing to the jump seat, usually reserved for flight attendants. A small, uncomfortable, rear-facing folding chair right next to the lavatory in the very back of the plane. You will sit in the jump seat. You will not recline. You will not order a drink. And when we land, you will remain seated until Corporal Thorne has deplaned. And you will render a salute as he passes. Do I make myself clear? Miller swallowed hard. But the humiliation was total. He would be sitting by the toilet, facing backwards, watching the entire plane judge him for the next 2 hours. Aye, sir. Miller choked out. Move, Stevens ordered. Miller grabbed his bag and began the long, agonizing walk to the back of the plane. This time, there was no swagger. This time, he kept his head down. As he passed row 34, the teenager pulled off his headphones and just shook his head. As Miller reached the back, he sat in the tiny, hard jump seat, the smell of the lavatory blue water filling his nose. He looked up the long aisle. Way up in the front, in seat 1A, he saw the flight attendant placing a glass of champagne on Arthur's tray table. He saw the businessman leaning over to shake Arthur's hand. He saw the old man smiling, and for the first time in his career, Staff Sergeant Miller understood what the uniform was actually supposed to mean. The Boeing 737 leveled off at 30,000 feet, cruising smoothly toward the nation's capital. In seat 1A, Arthur Thorne sat with a glass of champagne untouched on his tray table. He wasn't drinking it. He was staring at the bubbles rising to the surface, lost in thought. The comfort of the wide leather seat felt alien to his body, which was used to hard pews and harder luck. He kept his hand resting protectively on the torn plastic Piggly Wiggly bag, ensuring the Navy Cross was safe. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Stevens emerged, having handed the controls to his first officer. He didn't walk with the aggression he had shown earlier. He walked with the weariness of a man who had just defused a bomb. He knelt in the aisle next to Arthur, ignoring the flight attendant, who tried to offer him water. How are we doing, Corporal? Stevens asked quietly. The uniform, okay? Arthur nodded slowly. It's fine, sir. Just a scratch on the metal. It adds character, I suppose. He looked at the pilot. You didn't have to do that, Captain. Moving that boy, he's just young. He doesn't know. Stevens' jaw tightened. He knows now, Artie. Ignorance isn't an excuse for cruelty. He dishonored the uniform. I'm going to file a report with his command when we land. I'll make sure he loses that rocker on his sleeve. Arthur sighed, a sound that came from deep in his chest. He turned his head to look toward the back of the plane. toward the galley where Staff Sergeant Miller was currently sitting in the jump seat, staring at the lavatory door, stripped of his pride. "Don't bury him, sir," Arthur whispered. Stevens looked surprised. "Don't bury him. Arthur, he treated you like garbage. He stepped on the Navy Cross." "I know," Arthur said, his voice firm, "and he's suffering for it right now. Shame is a powerful teacher, but if you destroy his career, if you take his rank, he just becomes bitter. He becomes another guy who hates the world." "He learns nothing?" Arthur tapped the plastic bag. Gunny Vance, Silas. He wouldn't want a Marine destroyed over a mistake. He'd want him fixed. He could have let the captain drop the hammer. He could have watched that kid burn. Instead, he chose to lead. That is true strength. Stevens stared at Arthur for a long moment, seeing the wisdom etched into the old man's face. "You want to let him off the hook?" "No," Arthur said. "I want to invite him." "Invite him where?" "To the funeral," Arthur said. "He thinks the medal is a prop. He thinks the uniform is a costume. Let him come to Section 60. Let him hear taps. Let him see the hole in the ground. If he sees the cost, maybe he'll understand the value." The plane began its descent. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. As they taxied to the gate at Reagan National, the fasten seatbelt sign pinged off. But again, Captain Stevens grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have a Marine who needs to deplane first." Stevens walked to the back of the plane. Miller was sitting in the jump seat, his head in his hands. He looked up when he saw the captain, expecting the final blow, expecting the MPs to be waiting at the gate. "Get up, Staff Sergeant," Stevens ordered. Miller stood, grabbing his bag, looking defeated. "Sir, I'm ready for the report." "There isn't going to be a report," Stevens said, watching Miller's eyes widen in shock. "Not today. Corporal Thorne requested I stand down." Miller was stunned. He did, Stevens said coldly, "but he has a standing order for you. You are going to escort him off this aircraft. You are going to carry his bag, and you are going to listen to what he asks you." Stevens marched Miller to the front of the plane. The passengers watched in silence. Miller felt every set of eyes on him. When he reached seat 1A, Arthur was standing up, struggling with the plastic bag. Miller hesitated, then stepped forward. "Here," Miller croaked, his voice thick with emotion. "Let me take that, Corporal." He reached out for the Piggly Wiggly bag. He didn't snatch it this time. He took it with two hands, gently, like it was made of glass. "Thank you, son," Arthur said, looking Miller in the eye. There was no hate in Arthur's gaze, only tired patience. "You going to Arlington?" Miller nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Arthur said. "I need a ride. And Gunny Vance, he hates being late." They walked off the plane together, the old man in the flannel shirt and the young staff sergeant carrying the plastic bag. They walked up the jet bridge, into the busy terminal. Arthur stopped near the exit. He turned to Miller. "You busy tomorrow at 0900? Arthur asked. Miller shook his head. "No, Corporal." "Good," Arthur said. "We're burying him in Section 60. Come by. Meet the man whose medal you stepped on. He was a better man than me." "And he was a better Marine than you are right now. Because the time Aka says, but semikos no, tus that, semikos no, I would that, I spent is no, I would that, I spent a doing now, semikos no, I can't believe how quickly, I spent a doing now, 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 I spent a doing. But you can fix that. Arthur reached out and patted Miller on the shoulder. It wasn't a hard pat, it was a fatherly one. We build men, Staff Sergeant. We don't break them now. Go polish your boots. They look like hell. Arthur turned and walked toward the baggage claim, limping slightly, a giant among men. Miller stood there in the middle of the airport, clutching the strap of his bag, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. He realized then that he hadn't just been taught a lesson about respect, he had been taught a lesson about grace, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would be at Arlington at 0900, and he would stand at attention until the last note of taps faded away. Listen to me, that right there, that is the difference between a bully and a warrior. Staff Sergeant Miller had rank, but Corporal Thorne had authority. You can buy rank with time and service, but you buy authority with blood and character. We live in a world that loves to cancel people. We love to record someone at their worst moment and destroy their life. But the old Corps taught us something different. It taught us that you don't throw a Marine away if he can be salvaged. Arthur could have ended Miller's career with one word to that pilot. Instead, he gave him a path back. He gave him a chance to find his soul. Never judge a veteran by the clothes on his back or the seat on his ticket. You don't know who he carried out of the fire. You don't know who he left behind. And you certainly don't know who is watching. If you're still with me, if you felt that in your chest, do me a favor. Hit that like button for Gunny Vance. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep these stories alive. And in the comments I want you to write, Section 60. Let's fill the comments with respect for the ones who paid the bill. Until next time,